Hello, CIS27B. In this video, I am going to go over the final review for the course. I had posted this in Canvas, so I wanted you to check it out and go through, use it as a study guide, but I will cover the final review. For the final exam, we're going to have 50 questions, multiple choice, that will be released during the finals week, Monday through Thursday. You have access to it and you'll be required to use Lockdown browser. So for our final, you can find the final review posted in Canvas. You can download the document. We're going to cover unit 1 through 13 for ethical hacking. We'll start with question number 1. It asks you to fill in the blank. The blank allows the organization to identify security vulnerabilities, to repair the weaknesses and protect its assets. And that's ethical hacking. So in ethical hacking, we use the vulnerability and risk model, in which we will begin with identifying the vulnerabilities of the organization, the network, or the systems, address the vulnerabilities as it would be the risk in the environment, and then in order to protect the assets of the organization, which could be people, systems, networks, data, etc. So the answer for number 1 is ethical hacking. For question number 2, it asks you which pen testing attack phase consists of defining attack goals and intelligence gathering. And that's going to be the first step in pen testing attack phase. And in this phase, we're going to plan and perform reconnaissance. So for recon, we want to gather as much information as possible that is going to help us understand the type of tools and the tactics that we need in order to proceed in planning and prepare for the next few phases in pen testing. So that will be the first phase, planning and reconnaissance. For question number 3, what technique allows the attacker to collect information without directly accessing the target by collecting data from search engine, social media, and dumpster diving? And this is considered passive footprinting. So when we're footprinting, we can perform passive by not directly accessing the system itself, by using other resources and entity in order to obtain information about the target. So if you're using Shodan, which is a specialized search engine, or social media, or obtaining information from dumpster diving, that's considered passive footprinting. I want to point out that you need to know the difference between active and passive footprinting. This is only one case scenario, but you will have questions relating active footprinting and also fingerprinting. For number 4, what type of tools are used by attackers for cross-referencing when performing reconnaissance? So we would refer to OSINT, or known as OSINT, and also threat databases. This is going to allow us to obtain more information across multiple organizations, as the community provide you with a centralized database that contain different form of attacks, different form of tools, and that's how we can utilize some of the tools to be able to perform reconnaissance when we're pen testing. Number 5, what are the goals in DNS footprinting? So we know that DNS stands for domain name systems. This allows the server to be able to associate the public IP address to the domain name. So in order to find more about the target domains, we want to perform footprinting on the DNS, which gives you entry points where we would see the associated domains or the primary domain, like domain controllers, along with other subdomains such as the backup domain controllers. So when you're footprinting the DNS, it's going to give you the domains and associate domains in that particular network. Number 6, fill in the blank. The blank provides technical information about companies based on technical responsibilities, which helps the attacker identify the vulnerabilities of the organization, and that's known as competitive intelligence. This is a way that they would seek job postings to identify the responsibility of the specialist, the technician, the professionals in that organization. It really addressed some of the criteria in the job so they would understand more about what the organization would need. And if that organization is a target, that's going to give them the intelligence to be able to address in the tactic of the attack. Number 7, what is used to assess network vulnerabilities, traffic flow, and performance to troubleshoot issues and improve network availability. And so we spent a unit on talking about network sniffing and packet sniffing attack. And so we would use packet sniffers such as Wireshark, Ethereal, and some other tools in order to analyze our network traffic, our performance in the network for availability. So as a pen tester, you often would use packet sniffer to be able to look at your network vulnerabilities, how your traffic is flowing, whether it's congested, if you have latency, making sure that we retain and remain the management of the network at 99.9999%. And that's objective for the A in CIA. Question 8, true or false? Passive packet sniffing requires overcoming network security barriers and adding traffic to the network, which makes this type of packet sniffing easy to detect, and that's false. When you are interacting with the network and you're modifying the traffic or adding additional packets in the network flow, that's considered active packet sniffing. So this requires overcoming some of the barriers such as intrusion detection system and intrusion prevention system or filtering system. And when we're adding traffic to the network, it would make the sniffing process easy to detect. So you have to evade some of the security barriers or appliances and in order to perform active packet sniffing. So false for number 8. Number 9, when an attacker intercepts data packets and sends false messages on the network, redirecting traffic away from user's IP address to fake website and trick the user to enter login credential, what type of attacks are used? So there are multiple attacks in this case scenario. Number 1, we would look at the first part, which is intercepting data packets. When you're intercepting or eavesdropping, this is considered man-in-the-middle attack. And then when we're sending false messages to the network and redirecting traffic, that's going to require ARP sniffing, and ARP sniffing is going to allow us to look at the ARP table on the switches. And in order to be able to spoof the MAC and the IP addresses, we would need to identify the table and the content of that table for which IP is legitimate associated with to which MAC address for that particular network. And for the third part, which is the redirection to a fake website and tricking the user to have to log in with their credential, and that we can use DNS poisoning. And DNS poisoning simply is looking at DNS records. And so for the A records, that would be associating the domain name to the IP address. And so if we need to redirect to a different website, we need to modify that particular file or record. And with that, I wanted to add that if you want to trick the user into logging in we have to use pretexting or some form of phishing. So additional attack would be added to that for the last part, which is the login credential. So for question 9, you see that there are multiple attacks: man in the middle, ARP sniffing, and DNS poisoning. For number 10, true or false? A malware is a program designed to find and take advantage of security flaws or vulnerability in the application of the systems, typically for a malicious purpose, and that's false. So the key word here is to find and take advantage of security flaws. Now, some malware is advanced, but when we're looking at frameworks or exploit frameworks, usually you would have programs that are designed to identify the vulnerabilities of the system or networks or applications. And those vulnerabilities can be used in attacks. So most of the attacks that we see, the tactic is to first capitalize on the vulnerability of the targeted entity. It could be a system, it could be individual, or it could be the network. So false for number 10. Number 11, where can information of recent vulnerability be found? So once we go through reconnaissance, you would find different types of vulnerability. And if you're using certain tools to be able to identify that, it will give you the common vulnerability and exposures, which is known as CVEs. And these CVEs would have identifier or numbers that would be identify individual vulnerabilities that's associated with software and system or certain packages. So the databases from the vendor, such as Microsoft, or if you're using Linux or other type of applications, you would see that the vendors would provide specific lists or database of the common vulnerability and exposures. So we want to record the value of the CVEs and use the database to be identifying the fix or potential fix, if there are any, of the vulnerability from the vendor. Number 12, what type of attacks consist of adjusting server configuration to direct the users to malicious site? And earlier, we addressed DNS poisoning when we're redirecting the system or the user to a different server, a different system over the web. So when you are adjusting the server configuration for redirection of the user to a malicious site, that's considered DNS server hijacking. And so that would also encompass poisoning and other tactic within, but this is considered hijacking of DNS because now the user is redirected to the malicious site. For 13, what attack method targets NTLAN manager, NTLM authentication system? And when we went over password attack, we talk about different type of techniques. And one of the techniques is called pass the hash, PTH. So when you're using something like Kane enable, it capitalizes on pass the hash as password is stored with encryption. And with encryption, it creates a hash value. So if the hash value or the hash algorithm is predictable, this hash can then be interpreted to what we would see as a way to crack the password using NTLAN manager, which has a weakness, a vulnerability for the attack known as pass the hash. So when you're using different type of password cracking tools, you often see that this would be one of the feature that's incorporated in the tool where it examined the hash of the stored password and compare that to a known hash. So that way it would be able to predict the password easily compared to brute force or dictionary where we have to use word lists, and the longer the word list, the easier the attack. Number 14, which web server response status codes imply the URL of the requested resources has been changed permanently? And this is going to be 305. So I would expect that you would know the web server response status code for web server attacks. So we went over the exercises on how we would look at the banner from our web servers, how it responds. And so when you're looking at HTTP header contain servers response status codes such as 200, 400, 305, 301, etc. When you're fuzzing web server or a web application server, you would also obtain status codes. So it's important that we know different type of status code, and the answer for 14 is 305. For 15, what type of information can be found in the web server response body? So we talked about looking at the header when we're doing banner grabbing, but when we're using certain tools to be able to grab the banners, it's going to also give us the payload information. And so in the web server response body, this is where your payload exists, which is where the content or the data of what the client requests. So when the client visit a web server, right, they are submitting a GET HTTP, where the server would, because of TCP, it would synchronize and then respond. So with that, the server would then provide an index file or a certain HTML file, which is presented through the browser application as a web page. So with that, it would be the content or the data, which is what we see as payload. But in the cases where we would look at web scraping, this response body is going to give us additional information, just such as JSON and XML formatted data. So that is going to give you a little bit more detail on what the client system is requesting as data if they're pulling the data from a certain website. Number 16, what tool is used to grab the web application banner by disclosing the server information with its version, IP address, web page title, and running operating system? And in the lab, we use WhatWeb. This is a tool that we can pull the web application banner. There are many different types of tool. In the case where you can explore different open source tool, but this particular tool is going to give us the server details, like its public IP, the title for the web page, for the landing page, and the operating system, along with the web server software or the package that's used, such as Apache or NGINX or IIS. Number 17, what type of HTTP headers contain more information about the resource to be fetched or about the client requesting the resource? So the key word here is the resource to be fetched and the client requesting the resource. So that there are several different type of HTTP headers. And so for the resource to be fetched and the requesting resources, that will be request HTTP headers. So I expect you to know HTTP header types and their purpose. Number 18, what type of HTTP headers contain representations, independent information about data, including content length and encoding used for transport? And that will be the payload HTTP header. The keywords here are representation of independent information and data. So whenever you see data, that's going to pertain to payload. So it would give you the content length, like the size of your payload. And then for the type of data, it would also show the encoding type, like ASCII, UTF-8, and so on. So the encoding system used for that type of data. So that is payload HTTP headers. 19. How can an attacker obtain FTP server operating system versions? And so when we went through banner grabbing, we looked at HTTP server and also FTP server. So the attacker can obtain FTP's OS version by grabbing FTP banner, and we can simply use various tools for this. Now, if the FTP server is vulnerable, we'll be able to obtain more information if there are additional security measures, such as if they're using SFTP, right? We would then have to look at the type of security measure that's in place and be able to overcome that if we want to obtain additional information for pen testing. Number 20, true or false? SSH banner contains information about the server's identity, version, server configurations, changes of updates and services, and warnings and notifications to the client system, and that's true. So SSH stands for Secure Shell, and its banner, if you're using SSH server as a target, it's going to give you, like the other banners, it's going to give you the versions of the software, the configurations, any kind of updates. So we need to know all of these components from a SSH banner. 21. In OS fingerprinting, what type of results can contain incorrectly identifies the OS, leading to incorrect assumptions of potentially wasted resources? And so that would be, it would be false positive results. So your FPR, these are going to be incorrectly identifies the OS, which gives you the wrong assumption of that particular target. Now compared to false negative results, false negative result is not going to be able to identify the OS at all. So when we did the lab, some results will be able to get the operating system information, and then, for example, using Nmap, we might be able to find the OS information. But if that system has firewall or host-based firewall, it might not be able to give you the operating system, so that is considered false negative result when it cannot find the OS, where false positive result, it might give you incorrect OS offerings or OS information, which might lead you to the incorrect assumption. 22. How can an organization reduce risk of exposing sensitive information through pre-texting? And so if they perform regular or they host regular security training, which allows their employees and their people to have more awareness and understanding of what is pretexting and what is the outcome of pretexting. And most phishing techniques would require pretexting. And so that's just a way to trick the user to perform something. 23. Juanita receives a phone call from her bank, sorry about this, asking her to provide bank account information, credit card information, and security updates. And that is considered phishing because it is phone call and it asks the user to perhaps provide some very sensitive information such as credit cards. So phishing with a V. 24. What type of phishing tactics target a group of high executives to disclose company sensitive information? So the keyword here is targeting a group and high executives. So that's considered whaling and is a form of spear phishing. 25. Fill in the blank. The blank is an open source phishing tool that provides phishing templates for 33 famous websites such as Google, Facebook, GitHub, Yahoo, Snapchat, Spotify, LinkedIn, and so on. And in the lab, we had used multiple tools, but if you notice, most of these websites are social media websites. And so we had used social fish to practice what would be considered phishing technique for pen testing. But there are other tools that are available, open source or proprietary. True or false? External threats can cause significant harm to the company as they possess knowledge of the organization's infrastructure and sensitive data, making it easier for them to exploit vulnerabilities and bypass security measure. And that's false. It's insider threats because they know the internal operation, access to certain sensitive data, and it would make them easier to commit fraud, and they can bypass security measure because they know the internal networks and the internal operations of the organization. 27, what type of unintentional insider threats in the organization exposes an organization's sensitive information to threat through carelessness, and that's negligent insider threats. And the key word here is carelessness. 28. When a contractor uses his access to obtain company's proprietary designs for career advantages, what type of insider threat is this contractor? And that's intentional and third-party insider threat. Number one, this person is a contractor. That's a third party. And number two, there is intention in obtaining the proprietary design for career advantages. So it's both of these. 29. When an engineer contractor steals machinery designs to leverage his new job negotiation, what type of fraudulent activity is committed by this contractor? And that is intellectual theft property, because that property belongs to the organization. The machinery designs belong to the organization. So it's intellectual property theft. For 30, true or false? To mitigate insider threats, centralize the information for the collection, integration, analysis, and storage for all elements pertaining to the insider threats. And that's true. So we want to centralize the information, and we want to have integration and analysis to look at trend on how the data is being accessed. So analysis of logs is really important, right? I emphasize that over many units. And then we also want to look at how the permissions of the data is stored. So that is going to help us evaluate and reduce the risk of insider threats. 31, which of the following option is not a common result of the insider threats? So the result, if you have data leak, that's going to cause financial loss. So that's true. Loss of privacy, that could potentially be through data leak. Unauthorized information disclosure, that because if data leak, usually the data is being exfiltrated. And then the disruption of IT services, that's possible as well. So the option that is not true is the disruption of company's partnership, E. 32. What type of teams can be created for assessment, response, and management of potential insider threats? And this is a threat management team. 33. What type of attacks can be used to gain access to sensitive information by viewing packet details, logging credentials, personal data, and financial details? And sniffing attacks can do that. So when we sniff out packets, packets can also give us payload, which tells us the personal data and login credential. It also tells us the details in the server information, the public IP addresses, initiation vector. So sniffing attacks is normally the preferred tactic for the initial process in attacks. 34. In sniffing attack, how does an attacker extract information from the network traffic capture? And that is from examining packet headers and content. And in the case when we're working with encrypted data, data has to be decrypted. So to capture the key for decryption is also an added area in this type of attack. 35. Which of the following option is a type of security measures that are used to protect the network against sniffing attack? So to prevent or reduce the risk of sniffing attack, we should use encryption, and we would have different type of encryption algorithm for different purposes, like web compared to data. Implement VPNs, virtual private network. This is important in the wireless area or external connections such as remote access. Performing monitoring over your network. Segment the network with firewalls and use strong authentication methods, that including strong password, multi-factor, and so on. So all of the above. So make sure we know these individual options. 36. What type of attacks can be used for session hijacking in which the attacker positioned themselves between the client and the server to intercept and manipulate data? And that's man-in-the-middle attack. And again, coming back to what we talked about earlier, right? In a session hijack attack, often that you would incorporate other form of attack. So if they are positioned themselves to intercept, that would be considered a man-in-the-middle attack. 37. What would be the output when you're using TCP dump -d command in the Linux terminal, like Kali? So TCP dump is a tool that we can use to be able to obtain packet information, and it usually is incorporated with a lot of different pen testing type of Linux release. So by using this command with the option capital D, it's going to give you the interfaces for sniffing. Like if I'm using wireless, it's going to give me WLAN 0. Or if you're using Ethernet adapter, it's going to give you F0 or ETH0. So it is going to show you different interfaces that are available for sniffing. Very similar to what you see when you first open up Wireshark, and you would see a list of interfaces and you can choose your interface for sniffing with Wireshark. So in the back, you would see that is considered if it's built with TCP dump -d. For 38, what is used by the attacker to accurately guess the session ID of the user by analyzing the pattern based on known algorithm or random number generator to gain control over the user session? And this is considered session ID prediction. When we did the lab, we looked at like the developer view on the browser of that particular session, and we would see the session ID. So using the ID value, the attacker can put that into an algorithm to be able to predict potential other session ID or use a random generator to generate or guess additional session ID. And having that session ID, they can do the session hijack. So session prediction is an important task in session hijacking for the attack. 39. Which of the following is a security measure for session prediction in session hijack attack? A, use cryptographic functions. That's true. B, use secure random number generator to generate session ID. We just talked about that in the previous question. That's also true. C, regularly refresh and reduce lifespan of the session ID. That's also correct because some session ID does expire and it does time out. So if we reduce the lifespan, that's going to limit or shorten the time of the session ID. So we can better protect that particular session. And then D, install regular updates and patches for the session management system so that we don't want to have vulnerability for the session management system. So that's also true. So all of the above. Number 40, which of the following option is a response to session hijack attack? So option A, to terminate the affected sessions and reset the session token, that's correct. So during the session hijack attack, if it is detected, we want to terminate that particular session and we want to reset the session token because likely that if they capture the session token, they're able to hijack and access that particular session. So we want to reset the token. B, users should be prompted to change their password immediately. That's correct because in the case that if they captured the session, they would be able to authenticate as that user account. And C, close the security loophole. So we want to look at potential vulnerability or existing vulnerability that would allow the session hijack, like what we talked about in the last question. So A, B, C would be your choice. 41. What command is used to open Metasploit console? So after you install Metasploit, so if you're using Kali, you don't have to install this framework. But if you're using other Linux version, once you install it, you would use the CLI for Metasploit by calling up its console. And the command is msf console. And then through that, you would use its command. So we would activate the help option. It's going to give you the general commands for Metasploit, but refer to the documentation for more details. 42. True or false? Flooding the target system with network traffic or exploiting application vulnerabilities are techniques used by attackers to perform denial of service attack, and that's true. Denial of service attack usually just overwhelming the target system with a lot of requests or just generate a lot of traffic so that way it becomes congested and it becomes unavailable to the regular user. So true. 43. What type of denial of service attack can be performed by spoofing the IP address of the NTP server to send high volume of the responses to the target system? So the key word here is the NTP server. And I expanded on this in that particular unit lecture, why NTP is important, right? And how often it is being targeted because it's absolutely needed in the infrastructure. So that will be the NTP amplification attack. And because it's amplified with high volume of responses, and that will overwhelm the NTP servers, and it becomes unavailable for that network. 44, which of the following option is highly reconfigurable tool to simulate some application layer denial of service attack by prolonging HTTP connection in different ways. So when we did this lab, right, we use multiple tools and slow HTTP test is one of them. This is a tool that we can simulate DOS attack by just extending the connection, prolonging it so that way it would take longer to respond. And if we have massive amount of this, right, it would just carry out over time so that way the other users would not be able to get the response from the server. So slow HTTP test. 45. In DOS attack, what is used to send a spoof discovery packet to each of the UPnP universal plug and play device to request a large amount of data, and that it would be botnet. So the universal plug and play devices could be your wireless printer, um, all the devices that we would be connected via USBs. So some of the devices would then also be part of the IoT sets. So botnets is often the preferred choice where the attacker would be able to obtain um, systems across in different regions and different physical areas and making them bots or zombies and use those systems to be able to target and overwhelm the individual device. 46. Fill in the blank. A blank is a nation state censorship firewall or deep packet inspection appliance, which can be used to launch volumetric floods. And we talked about some example that would use middle box. Middle box is a type of filter system that could also be inspection appliance or firewall. And they often are implemented in countries or regions that needs filtering, like web filtering, what kind of website the users or people can access. So those are known as middle box. But they can also be capitalized for DOS attacks. And in that week, we go into some example of how these middle boxes are used. 46. Which of the following security appliances is used to analyze system logs, file integrity, and user activities to identify an unauthorized access or malicious activities on the host of the system? So the keyword here is host system and analyze system logs and file integrity and activities. So this, when you analyze and you examine and you trying to look at unauthorized access, that's just a detection process. So it's host intrusion detection system. So HIDS. 48. When evading network intrusion detection system, what method is used to split malicious payloads into smaller elements, making it more challenging for the intrusion detection system to analyze and detect any malicious content? This is known as fragmentation, by breaking that up into smaller pieces, because the intrusion detection system might have a signature or behavior rules that are set for the packets or the payload size to be at a certain level. So if we use fragmentation, the IDS would not be able to match with its known signature or behavior rules. 49. Which of the following techniques is used to evade signature-based or behavior-based IDS? So you would see attacker encrypt the malicious code, because encryption is going to hide the code. It can go undetected. They can also change the malicious code structure, because there's specific code structure that's specified in the signature, or could be a certain behavior that's specified in the system. So if they change the malicious code structure, that's going to also evade the IDS. Inject the code into a legitimate files or other code so they can embed it. You see Trojan, it has a similar structure like this. So it's just embedded with the malicious file in a benign file. So code injection is commonly used for security attack purposes. And then also compression changes the way the code would be. So compression could be packing the code in a different way. So that is also a way to evade the IDS. So A through D are the correct options. The incorrect option is to compile the code. 50. What tool can be used to identify and fingerprint web application firewall WAF products to HTTP requests and analyzes the response. So in the lab, we use WAF W00F WAF. This is a way that we can look at web application firewall. Now, depending on the firewall that's implemented on the system, sometimes these open source tools don't directly identify specific firewall. It might be able to tell you that the firewall exists, right? So it could be varied. But there are other open source and proprietary tools that you can use, but this is one that we use in this particular class. 51, what Linux command is used to perform port scan for HTTP, HTTPS of the target with IP address 10.0.5.16 using PyonCat. So to be able to perform port scan, and you can see HTTP is port 80, HTTPS is port 443. So we would use PyonCat-Z, and then our target IP address 10.0.5.16. Then we would follow that with the port number, port 80 for HTTP, 443 for HTTPS. And likely, a lot of administrators prefer to use 8080, so we can also include 8080 in our port scan. So keep in mind that this is an active scan. So based on that, the system will respond. So that way it is also going to detect who's asking it. 52, what type of firewalls are used in smaller networks with consistent traffic patterns? So if you're using a firewall to detect traffic or filter traffic, I should say, if it's consistent and it's for the smaller network, we should use static packet filtering firewall compared to dynamic. 53, true or false? Proxy firewall is more secure in filtering application-based activities because of the user authentication and encryption. That's false. Proxy firewall incorporates user authentication and anonymization of internal network and user access information. So we can set up proxy firewall, but it is not for secure application-based activity. 54. What type of firewall inspects the payload packets? The payload of the packets uses threat intelligence, adapts the flow of the application, and operates from layer 2 to layer 7 of the OSI model. So this is an all-in-one firewall, and this is known to the industry as next generation firewall, your NGFW. This operates from the low level, which is layer 2, and all the way to layer 7. So next generation firewall. 55. What type of cross-site scripting attacks consist of sending a malicious URL to the user to trick the user to interact with the malicious site using the injected code that travels to the vulnerable website, which forwards to the user browser to execute the codes from the trusted source. So this is called the reflected cross-site scripting. And the reason why it's reflected is that it is reflected back to the browser for the code execution. So the code is being injected when the user visits the malicious website, and then it would then incorporate it in the browser for execution. So that's called the reflected cross-site scripting. 56. What can be used to reduce web server or web application attacks by restricting scripts and images that a page can load and framing by other pages? And this is known as content security policy. This can be incorporated with some safe browsing mechanism on the browser. It can also be set with the rules for if you're implementing certain type of web application firewall rules. So that can be set up for CSP. And we did a lab where we use that to be able to look at CSP. 57. In web server attacks, what is used by the attacker to see the in-depth structure of the website? And they would use what the technique that's called web mirroring. So that is going to allow them to examine the structure of the website, how it's created, its content, multiple web applications, what are they, how are they involved, what kind of authentication, and so on. 58. What is used to determine the website cookies that are included in the request originating from the other websites? And this is called same site cookies. And again, when we were looking at SAP, it also examines same site cookies. So cookies are really important, especially for when we're looking at security and web application security. This is going to allow us to look at credentials, right? Personalizations for the user, even browsing history and so on. 59. A blank contains unpredictable value that is generated by the server-side application and shared with the client, which is used when the user needs to perform an action that contains sensitive information, prevents the attacker from successfully executing the attack. And this is known as the cross-site request forgery CSRF tokens. The keywords here are the unpredictable value that's generated on the server side. So that is a token. And we would use this to prevent cross-site request forgery, your CSRF, because the token is going to allow the user to perform a certain action for web application. For example, if I need to make a payment, right? So if we utilize the tokens, we can control the security for that particular web application, but on the server side. And that token would consist of what the user is allowed to do. So it would limit the privilege for that particular user in certain area, like in databases and other things that are linked to the web application. 60. What type of pen testing tool is an open source and it's known as man-in-the-middle proxy, which intercepts and inspects messages that's sent over the browser and web application, modifying the content if needed, and forward those packets to the destination. This is a tool that I mentioned earlier in the prior question. It's called Z-Attack Proxy, which is known as ZAP or ZAP. It's an open source tool for pen testing. It goes through and it also gives you spider options and web application analysis. It looks at some security measures that are in place or not. 61. In the reconnaissance stage of web application attack, which the following information is gathered. So in the web application attack, we would gather application URLs. As you know that even on the same website, you would have different applications. And so those are just having additional extensions. So for example, I would log into the account. I might see my account landing page, which give me maybe my account summary. And then I would click make a payment. That's a separate application that is part of that particular site. So when you look at the URL, that's an additional directory that it would include all the files and the components for that particular web application piece. You also would be able to obtain the server details, like what we seen with the web server attack information earlier from banner grabbing. application frameworks, and also associated subdomains. So these 4 elements are going to be gathered for the web application attack. 62, true or false, regularly rotating cryptographic keys and securely storing them prevent unauthorized access to encrypted data. That's true. What type of attacks does a wireless device like wireless router or access point create a copy of company's AP, lure the wireless user to the rogue access point and capture the user sensitive information, credential, and sessions? This is known as an evil twin. An evil twin attack, the attacker would use a wireless device that acts as a secondary or a copy of the access point. It would have the same SSID. So the users would then access it and then try to log into sites, which then their credential and sensitive information would be captured. So evil twin for 63. 64, what type of attack is usually performed when attempting WPA attacks? So WPA, whether you're using WPA or WPA2, you would then need to crack the encryption or the passphrase. So what you would see is password attack. And that can go from brute force to dictionary to pass the hash to rainbow attacks. And so when you brute forcing performance, your system performance is a consideration. So processing power and also how far you are from that particular target. So your bandwidth also is part of the consideration for planning password attack. 65. Which of the following protective measures are used to secure wireless network against war driving? And we want to disable SSID beaconing because war driving is simply a way to detect open available network or vulnerable wireless network. We can change wireless router access point default settings. So we don't want to use admin as credential, and also, configuration that are default. Use encryption in wireless communication. So that's important. So it's not detectable, especially your plain text type of data or information. And we want to set the filter for MAC address. So a lot of this can be done in the access point or the wireless router itself. So A through D. 66, what type of Bluetooth attack exploit the Object Exchange Protocol, OBEX protocol, to exchange information between the wireless devices? And this is loose snarfing attack. Loose snarfing uses OBEX protocol. 67, what type of SQL injection attack entails sending SQL query to the database, prompting the application to return result, such as true or false? And that's called Boolean or content-based SQL injection attack. 68, to prevent SQL injection, what can be used as templates to transmit parameter values later to prevent attacker from changing the intent of the query, even if the SQL commands are inserted by the attacker, and we want to use prepared statement. So when we talk about SQL injection in that unit, we touch on different security measure, right? Having prepared statements is going to reduce some risk. It won't reduce all the risk in SQL injection. 69, to reduce the risk of SQL injection, what can be used to limit the attack surface by ensuring data is of the right syntactic and semantic validity by setting the rules in the server using regular expression to control what the user can input into the form. We can create the allow list for input validation, what is allowed for the user to input. And this is also can be incorporated in the design itself. So in development, this is part of how you would design your web application on how data is inserted into the form. 70. When performing SQL injection testing, what is output for the query union select null concat table name 0 hex 0a column name from information schema dot columns where table name is user. So as you can see in this particular query, we're using a union select and concat. Now in the parameter here, we put in table name and column name. So those things are expected to be output. And we define the variable table name as users, as string here. So that's going to reference the table called users. So the output would be the column names of the table users. 71, which of the following options are components of common IoT devices? So in an IoT device, as it is a computing device, you would have processor, memory, firmware, data exchange service, because all IoT devices send some kind of data. Think about your wristband for health, like, or your smart Apple Watch. So data is being exchanged. So there's data exchange services and then interfaces. So interfaces could be touchscreen, interface could be network interface. So all of these are components of IoTs. 72, true or false? The common signs of compromised IoT device include unusual activities or processes, high data or bandwidth usage, unresponsiveness, unknown request message, unused account activities. That's true. So make sure we know about unusual activities and all of the behavior of a compromised IoT device. 73. Which of the following security practices and measures should be used to improve IoT security? We should use strong password and multi-factor authentication. We should update software and firmware. We should disable unnecessary app permissions, and we should use VPN for wireless connections. So all of these options are important for security measures of IoT, Internet of Things. 74, based on IoT attacker model, what type of access is established when the attacker connects to the IoT via the wireless network? So based on this model, this is known as local access compared to your physical access could also pertain to touching, opening the case of the device, or unscrewing the device and so on. 75. Which of the following IoT access levels would allow privileges for debugging, examining source code, or root level access to the firmware? And that is considered manufacturer level access. This is the highest level of access, where it would have development access and also firmware level access. So very, very important that we look at this particular level of access and controlling the privilege or change the default setting for the manufacturer level access. 76, true or false? Cloud attackers target service platforms such as computing devices, host application, and storage services. And that's true. So that's the nature for cloud. Companies would use cloud for infrastructure, for software, for functions, for hosting storages or having storages for data. So that is computing services. And then in some cases, you would see applications and storages. So true. 77, which of the following is not a common type of cloud attacks? So we know that cloud can be targeted for denial of service attack, also account hijacking to be able to have administrative privilege to the cloud. User account compromise, that's part of the previous option. They can also inject malware for different purposes for account compromise, or even if ransomware to be able to lock the cloud. Cookie poisoning, this goes back to account compromise and hijacking. And in a lot of cases, we would see SQL injection to be able to obtain or exfiltrate data. So G is the incorrect option. 78. What type of attack is performed by placing the malicious virtual machine on a legitimate physical host used by the cloud customer to access confidential information on the victim's machine? And that is known as the side channel attack. 79. Which of the following security practices mitigate cloud configuration vulnerabilities? So the practice include least privilege principle. We do that for all infrastructure, systems, servers, networks. We also need to look at access management. And on the cloud, we want to use IAM and PAM. Patch system and applications, very important. So if you have OSs, instances, container, making sure that you reduce the vulnerability by patching your applications and your software. Remove default setting in the system and applications. Configure security settings in system and apply security design application development. So we want to integrate SecDevOps for cloud administration. 80. True or false? By exploiting shadow APIs, the attacker can perform malicious code injection to obtain application access and data. That's false. Using API parameter exploitation, not shadow API, the attacker can perform code injection to get data and access. 81. Which of the following options are preventative security measures against cloud attacks? So option A is incorrect. Install and use network proxies to monitor and regulate data flow. So that's incorrect. Option B, we should implement data encryption for data at rest, in motion, and in use. We should manage access control to system services, data applications, and API. We should use cloud security posture management, your CSPM, to detect and monitor threats, automate response to threat, and manage cloud assets and mitigate threats. And lastly, 82. What are used to control and rotate privileged cloud access accounts? And I mentioned this earlier. We should use identity and access management, your IAM, and privileged access management, your PAM. And this concludes the final review for CIS27B, ethical hacking. And if you have any questions, please let me know. Thank you.